pain at the pump, and it's not going away anytime soon. From farming in Europe to fertilizer in Africa, Russia's war on Ukraine pinches pocketbooks around the world. See how some countries are fighting back. Now, on the Inside Story, Ukraine, food, fuel, and photo ops.
Hi, I'm Anita Powell, VOA White House correspondent. America's investment in Ukraine's ability to beat back Russia's invasion is growing, from the already promised military aid and intelligence sharing to visits to Kyiv by high-level government officials, and promises to fill behind any grain shortages caused by the war. We'll explain how Ukraine and Russia are key links for the world's food chain. But significant moves are being made to change the look of the battlefield. Among those recent moves, fighters from Belarus undergoing training in Poland to form Belarusian units in order to battle Russia on Ukraine's side. And their goals do not end there. VOA Eastern European Bureau Chief Miroslava Gungadze got exclusive access to the Pohonia training ground in Poland.
Critics say Belarus has become an accomplice in Putin's war on Ukraine, but many Belarusians who held peaceful protest in 2020 against their longtime ruler Alexander Lukashenko have decided to take up arms for Ukraine. Many see an opportunity to free their country from dictatorship. At this training ground in Poland, volunteers are taking their first battle lessons. A former Polish police officer, now a business owner, and his war veteran partner are training Belarusians who sign up for new regiment known as Pohonia. After a week of training in Poland, the volunteers are transferred to base in Ukraine for a more vigorous months-long exercise. The regiment's leader expects 40 people to sign up each month and for the numbers to steadily grow.
They are highly motivated Belarusians. They have only two targets. One target is to help the our brothers in Ukraine, because we have a common enemy.
The volunteers are resolute in their decision to gain combat experience. Andrei says his family is in Belarus and asked that his face not to be shown for security reasons.
It's not only the war of Ukraine. This is the war of the whole free world, and Belarus as well, because Belarus is almost 30 years under dictatorship, and it's very painful for us, for the Russian people who really want to be free. And our desire, our dream, after a defeat of Putin, we hope that the regime of Lukashenko will be destroyed as well.
For Kirill, who left Belarus long ago, this fight is about freedom as well. He started helping Ukrainians buy military equipment and then realized he had a big battle at home to support.
I realized that we have some Belarusian volunteers, military volunteers, and they are not very good equipped. So we decided to start help them. We started to send them equipment.
Kirill hopes to show that many Belarusian people, unlike Lukashenko, do not support Putin's aggression.
That's our guilty before the Ukrainian people, because for now we are who hold the Belarusian passport. We are the enemies for them, because our country, which is also occupied by the tyrant Lukashenko, and bomb are shelling from Belarus territory to Ukrainian cities and villages. And only that way we should provide as much help as we can to Ukraine and their people in their fighting with the Russian aggression.
Kirill, like many, was inspired by protest in Belarus 2 years ago. Back then, their protest was peaceful, and protesters were not prepared for the brutality of Lukashenko's forces. Now, Lukashenko's opponents are working to get ready for battle. The Belarusian leadership in exile last month endorsed the Pohonya regiment. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the woman who is believed by many to be the rightful winner of Belarusians' 2020 election, on Twitter, referred to the unit as a base for the new professional Belarusian army. The unit's leader, Vadim Prokopiev, sees the endorsement as a first step toward freeing Belarus from Lukashenko.
I think the time has come that our leadership, our political leadership in exile, take more desperate and more decisive measures. And if Ukrainians will see enough potential and enough power, I think the recognition of a government in exile is a very good and strong move.
He says his regiment is growing, and soon VOA has learned some experienced trainers, including U.S. Army veterans, will join the fight. Miroslava Gongadze, VOA News, Warsaw.
Among Russia's concerns ahead of its invasion was the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, bringing the Western alliance to Russia's border. It now seems that the invasion will put NATO right on Russia's doorstep anyway, as Finland and Sweden are seeking membership. For Finland, ending decades of neutrality has a significant resonance, especially along its 1,300-kilometer border with Russia. That's where we sent our Henry Ridgwell.
Coloured marker stones either side of a small river are all that separate Russia and Finland. For decades, the two countries have enjoyed peaceful relations, but this border could soon become a frontier between East and West, a geopolitical fault line.
The border between Finland and Russia stretches some 1,300 kilometres, much of it forests and wilderness. And if Finland does join NATO, it would become by far the longest frontier between the alliance and Russia, and that could transform this region.
Moscow has threatened what it calls a military technical response if Finland joins the alliance. There are fears the border could be a future flashpoint.
Could Russia then try to take a playbook of, say, Georgia and try to create some sort of frozen conflict, invade a small part of Finland with the very few forces it has left? Certainly could try, but Finland has prepared for this militarily.
For now, there is no visible military presence. At the major Valima crossing point, there is little to indicate the emergence of any new Iron Curtain.
We don't know what will happen and how situation will change between our countries. But at this time, situation is calm and border traffic is flowing smoothly.
When Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, there was a brief uptick in crossings.
We had a lot of persons fleeing from Russia, of course Europeans, Americans. Actually we had like 52 nationalities coming.
Now cross-border traffic is running at just 10% of normal levels. Russia's Sputnik coronavirus vaccine is not approved in Europe, so most Russians can't enter. Finland's bid to join NATO could choke off the trickle of visitors. The decline has hurt the regional economy. Frontier shopping malls are now ghost towns. Before COVID, about 2 million Russians visited Finland every year. Many stayed in Lappeenranta, a few kilometers from the border on the shores of Lake Saimaa.
We have used to do cooperation with Russians. Here are, for example, living more than 3,000 Russian-speaking inhabitants. It was about almost 2 million Russians coming every year in this area. But now there are coming very few tourists here. And we have estimated that we are losing 1 million euros in every day because of this situation.
Much of what happens at this border will depend on Russia's reaction to Finland's NATO membership bid. The chill of rapidly worsening relations between East and West is keenly felt on this frontier. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, Valima, Finland.
Ukraine has long been considered the breadbasket of Europe. Its fertile wheat fields supply about 20% of the world's high-grade wheat. The World Food Programme buys half its grain from Ukraine, and the shift in Russia's tactics puts Ukraine's wheat fields in the crosshairs. VOA's Heather Murdoch went to Zaporizhia Oblast in Ukraine to find out how the farmers and their crops are weathering the war.
Along the highways in Zaporizhia, Ukrainian billboards say things like, "Put your Molotov cocktail here," with pictures of red arrows pointing to sensitive spots on Russian tanks. In recent weeks, strikes on the city have become more common, and in the Zaporizhia countryside, Russia controls 85% of the oblast's farmland after more than 2 months of war. These fields are about 30 kilometers from the front lines where the Russian military is stationed. Farmers here say they are littered with the remnants of missiles from attacks. Ukrainian farmers wear body armor, hoping the fields will stay safe enough to work, at least through the harvest over the next 2 months.
Sometimes missiles hit fields. Other fields are impossible to reach because they're in the occupied territory. The war has made our job extreme.
Ukraine and Russia together produce more than a quarter of the world's wheat, as well as other major food items like barley, sunflower seed oil, and corn. The war in Ukraine has strained food supplies and increased prices across the globe. In the worst hit, poorest, and most war-torn countries, like Yemen, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan, many people could soon face starvation in part due to the war in Ukraine, according to the United Nations. Regional officials say Zaporizhia, one of Ukraine's top growing regions, usually produces 2.7 million tons of wheat, mostly for export, but this year expects only about 260,000 tons. Most of it will stay in Ukraine. Next year could be even scarcer, officials add, without cash from the current crop for fertilizers, gas, insecticides, and other farming needs.
Farmers do not have enough capital right now to invest in future crops. They have grain, but they cannot sell it. How can they operate without money? Banks are giving limited loans, but we are under martial law. They are being cautious.
The immediate problem for global food supplies is that attacks have shut down major ports and train lines in Ukraine. The remaining rail and road routes cannot carry enough food far enough. And farmers say as the war intensifies in eastern Ukraine, even supplies to feed Ukraine and its military could be at risk.
We can't tell what will happen tomorrow. If Russian occupiers come here, they could take our lands. They could ruin the fields. It's a huge risk. It's high stakes, like playing Russian roulette.
He says if Ukrainian farmers lose this game, the results could be catastrophic for global food needs and apocalyptic for Ukrainian farming communities. Heather Murdoch, VOA News, Zaporizhia, Ukraine.
Ukraine has traditionally been a breadbasket for Europe. Its rich soil and mostly flat geography have allowed 70% of the country to be used as agricultural land. In 2020, Ukraine was the world's biggest exporter of seed oils like sunflower and rapeseed. It was the world's 4th largest exporter of corn and 5th largest exporter of wheat. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has sharply changed the country's agricultural outlook. Many of Ukraine's crops are planted in April or May. Ukrainian officials say farmland used for planting spring crops could be cut by more than half this year because of the war. Spring crops include barley, corn, sugar beets, sunflowers, and soybeans. An exception is winter wheat, which is planted in the fall and harvested in the summer. Ukraine's then agriculture minister, Roman Lyshenko, told Reuters in March that only 60% of the sowed winter wheat might be harvested. While much of Ukraine has arable land, some of its most fertile soil is in the south, where there has been heavy fighting. Wheat production is highest in the country's southern regions, where millet and barley is also grown. Rapeseed production is prominent in the country's west, while corn is mostly grown in Ukraine's north. Ukrainian officials say it is too soon to predict fall grain output, which depends on both successful planting and harvesting. However, a Ukrainian agriculture consultancy is predicting the grain harvest to fall by more than half. Farmers in Ukraine face numerous challenges to a successful harvest. Even if they can access their land for planting and harvesting, they must still obtain items that are hard to get in war. Labor is also in high demand, with many farm workers having joined the army. Ukrainian officials say they are working on a system to allow temporary military exemptions for agriculture workers. While Ukraine traditionally has a surplus of food which it exports, this year officials are worried the population could go hungry. As a result, the government has banned or limited exports of many staples. Limiting exports will further damage Ukraine's economy and could also affect global food supplies. The top destinations for Ukraine's corn exports in 2020 were China and Europe, while much of its wheat exports in 2020 went to the Middle East and Asia. The war has already driven up the global price of grains, leading the United Nations to warn of a food crisis in places like Egypt and Lebanon.
Because it depends so much on Russian oil and natural gas, the European Union could not agree this month on new economic sanctions targeting Russia's energy sector, which is chugging along just fine. VOA's Arash Arabsadi explains.
Despite sanctions squeezing much of Russia's economy, cash still flows through the country's rich energy sector. This comes after a much smaller drop in Russian oil exports than anticipated.
Many people expected that we'd see 2 to 3 million barrels a day of oil production capacity lost in the first month, including the International Energy Agency and a lot of consultants. That didn't happen. It's probably been less than 1 million barrels a day. And so now I think we're at a point where EU officials are saying, what's next? How can we ratchet up the economic pressure on Russia? Because what we've done so far isn't working.
Western sanctions have led to retaliatory actions by Moscow, further accelerating calls in Europe for alternative energy sources. In France, farmers mash together crops and agricultural waste before fermenting the mix, producing biofuel to potentially power hundreds or thousands of nearby homes. In Portugal, a floating array of 12,000 solar panels the size of 4 football fields is that country's latest effort to ditch fossil fuels. Meanwhile, Germany's vice chancellor recently accused Russia of using fossil fuels as a weapon. Yet the price of oil keeps going up. That means even by selling less oil, Russia is bringing in more money.
It's a bit of a paradox. The more momentum there is to actually, take this oil offline, the bigger the price impact will be for the countries that import Russian energy. And that is economic pain that EU policymakers might be willing to tolerate. But you can't attempt to take the world's largest oil and products exporter out of the market without having an economic impact. And it's a global impact.
Further straining global supply chains, truckers and the trucks that deliver almost everything we buy are facing spikes in the cost of diesel fuel. Yet one part of the EU's upcoming sanctions proposal says Cahill could really hurt Russia.
If you cut off shipping insurance, that means that any company with a tanker can't get insurance to transport stuff from Russia. And that's a big risk. What if that tanker sinks? What if it runs aground? What if there's some sort of environmental disaster if they have no insurance? So cutting off that tanker insurance is actually kind of an overlooked part of the EU sanctions package. That could actually have a big impact.
While Europe navigates choppy energy waters, Cahill says Russia has had some luck selling oil to India and China, but often at steep discounts around $30 per barrel below market value. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
Sanctions aimed at hampering Russia's economy have a ripple effect throughout the world. For farmers in Ghana, a shortage of Russian fertilizer could cause concerns for food production. Our Sinanu Tord explains how farmers are adapting from Abukrom, Ghana.
Cocoa farmer Grace Ayer says her plants have started fruiting and need fertilizer to ensure their growth. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to a shortage and raised last year's prices up to 5 times higher.
The rains have started, and it is the right time to apply fertilizers. Time is running out on us, and we still don't have access to fertilizers from the government or even from the market. We have heard that in the past, some farmers use chicken droppings as fertilizers, and they got good yields, so we've decided to give it a try.
Russia is one of the world's top exporters of fertilizer and inputs, and the main supplier to Ghana, the world's second biggest exporter of cocoa. Record sanctions over Russia's invasion of Ukraine are making imports virtually impossible. The Ghana Cocoa Board says they expect fertilizer prices to keep going up.
So what Cocoa Board is doing presently is introducing the farmers to poultry manure as a substitute to the fertilizer which we procure on the market. And it is our belief that this will be able to ameliorate the problem or the challenge, the availability and the price issue we'll have on our industry.
The board says chicken droppings are high in nutrients and better for nature.
It is scientifically proven that the poultry manure is a good substitute for the fertilizers. And this is organic. So if you have a substitute, why wait until you are hit the hardest?
Ghana's Ministry of Agriculture says they are also easing the fertilizer shortage by building compost sites across the country.
Everywhere there's this compost site. Once that one comes on stream, and that one is basically organic fertilizer. So we are going to see how we can combine the inorganic, just small of the inorganic with the organic, and then we are good to go. And that is the way to go for us as a country.
The UN says Russia's war on Ukraine, a top global supplier of wheat, is pushing up prices and threatening food security. The International Monetary Fund says poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic are being hit hardest. But Ghana's Ministry of Agriculture is confident a shift to organic fertilizers can help prevent a food crisis and might be environmentally friendly in the long run. Sana Anutod for VOA News, Ebukrom, Ghana.
In case you haven't noticed, there have been a lot of high-ranking U.S. government officials making visits to Ukraine, meeting President Zelensky in Kyiv. From the First Lady to the leader of the Senate Republicans, the messages sent by these high-level visits are meant for a wide array of audiences at home and abroad. U.S. President Joe Biden has dispatched several high-level Americans to war-ravaged Ukraine in recent weeks. But the White House says that he has no firm plans to make the dangerous trip himself. It's not for lack of desire, says White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
He wants to visit Ukraine clearly in the future, but there's no plans to go at all at this time, I should say. He sent Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin to Kyiv to demonstrate our unwavering commitment to Ukraine, and the First Lady, as you all know, went for Mother's Day to send an important message that the American people stand with the people of Ukraine.
Biden first sent his two top cabinet officials, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, to the under-siege capital. While there, they announced a nominee to fill the shuttered U.S. Embassy in Kyiv and pledged $713 million in military support. Then it was the First Lady's turn. She crossed into a border town and made an emotional appeal on Mother's Day, joining a fellow mother, Ukraine's First Lady.
I thought it was important to show the Ukrainian people that this war has to stop, and this war has been brutal, and that the people of the United States stand with the people of Ukraine.
And 2 U.S. congressional delegations have gone to Kyiv to show their support. But presidential visits to war zones have a higher bar, says presidential historian Jeremy Suri. They involve high risk, and historically, he says, little payoff.
There's no evidence in any of the examples I can think of that a presidential visit actually made a difference in the outcome of the war. It is symbolic, it matters politically, but not visiting doesn't destroy your policy making, just as visiting doesn't make your policy.
And he noted presidents have previously visited places where there is a U.S. military presence. Not here, which makes this extraordinarily risky for a man as high profile as the president. And he added, mortal danger isn't the only risk a president faces there.
So there is the infamous case of George W. Bush when giving a joint press conference with the Iraqi leader, an Iraqi journalist throwing a shoe at him. Many things can go wrong when you're outside of your own country, when you're in a war zone, and when even with all the checking that you do, you don't really know who the people are who are around the president. And that's particularly problematic when it's not American soldiers in Ukraine, as it was in most of the other cases we've talked about.
Suri notes that the perils of Ukraine mean that any Biden visit will be necessarily shrouded in secrecy until after the fact. And so, it may be some time before these two leaders are again face-to-face. And as long as the war continues, the same probably goes for these two. That's all for now. Follow me on Twitter at 6armspowell and follow VOA News on Instagram and Facebook. Stay up to date at voanews.com. Thanks for being with us. See you next week on The Inside Story.